welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we explore the legendary tale of Maui, the clever demigod whose magical fishhook pulled entire islands from the ocean's depths. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes now, and let your body settle into this comfortable position. Feel the weight of the day melting away from your shoulders, from your mind, as you prepare to journey across the vast Pacific Ocean to a time when gods walked among mortals and heroes shaped the very islands beneath their feet. Tonight, we travel to the realm of Polynesian mythology, where the ocean stretches endless and blue, where volcanic islands rise like dreams from the depths, and where one figure stands above all others in the pantheon of heroes. His name echoes across 1,000 islands, whispered in the trade winds that dance between palm fronds. Maui, the trickster, the culture hero, the demigod whose fishing hook pulled entire landmasses from the ocean floor. As you breathe slowly and deeply, imagine the gentle lapping of waves against an ancient shore. The air carries the scent of frangipani and salt, the warmth of tropical breezes that have blown for countless generations. In this place between sleeping and waking, between the mortal world and the realm of legend, we will witness the extraordinary tale of a being born between two worlds. Let the rhythm of the ocean waves match the rhythm of your breathing. In and out, like the eternal tide that shapes all islands, all shores, all destinies. For in the beginning, there was only the vast ocean, and from its depths would rise not only islands, but legends that would endure for all time. Part 1: The Birth of a Legend. In the time before time, when the world was young and the boundary between the divine and mortal realms was as thin as morning mist, there lived a woman named Taranah. She was no ordinary mortal woman, for her beauty was legendary throughout all the islands, and her lineage traced back to the very gods themselves. Taranah possessed the grace of the ocean currents and the mystery of the deep waters, and it was said that when she walked along the shoreline, even the waves would pause to admire her reflection. Yet Taranah carried within her heart a secret love affair that would shake the foundations of both heaven and earth. For she had caught the attention of Makiatutara, a great spirit of the underworld, a being whose power was as vast as the ocean depths and whose passion burned like the volcanic fires that birth islands. Their meetings were clandestine, occurring in the liminal hours between day and night, when the veil between worlds grows thin and spirits can walk among the living. When Taranah discovered she was with child, she knew that this pregnancy would be unlike any other. The child growing within her was conceived in the union of mortal flesh and divine essence, destined to be neither fully human nor completely divine, but something magnificent and terrible between the two. As the months passed, strange omens began to manifest around her. The tides would change at her approach, fish would leap from the water as if in salutation, and the very air would shimmer with an otherworldly energy. The night of the birth arrived during a fierce storm that lashed the islands with unprecedented fury. Lightning split the sky like fishing lines cast by the gods, and thunder rolled across the ocean like the footsteps of titans. The waves rose higher than anyone had ever seen, as if the ocean itself was participating in this cosmic event. Taranah, heavy with child and sensing that her time had come, sought shelter in a sacred cave that faced the endless sea. But as her labor pains intensified, Taranah was overcome with a terrible premonition. Perhaps it was divine intuition, or perhaps it was fear of what such a child might bring into the world, but she became convinced that this birth would herald great changes, not all of them welcome. In cultures across Polynesia, it was sometimes believed that children born under such extraordinary circumstances might bring either great fortune or devastating calamity. When the child was finally born, he emerged not with the usual cries of a newborn, but with an otherworldly luminescence that filled the cave with soft, pulsing light. His eyes held the depth of the ocean and the fire of the stars, and even as an infant, there was something ancient and knowing in his gaze. Yet overcome with fear and uncertainty, Taranah made a decision that would echo through legend for all time. She took the infant, still connected to her by the cord of life, and wrapped him in her hair, binding him in a cocoon of mortal love and divine abandonment. Then, with tears streaming down her face, she cast the bundle into the raging sea, believing perhaps that the ocean which had given her this child through his divine father should reclaim him. The waves accepted this offering and carried the newborn away into the storm-tossed darkness, while Terranau collapsed in grief and regret, not knowing whether she had saved the world from a terrible fate or condemned it to the loss of its greatest hero. But the gods had other plans for this remarkable child. As the bundle containing the infant drifted on the wild currents, it was discovered by his divine grandparents, Tamanuitera, the great sun god, and Hina Kukahi, the moon goddess. They recognized immediately the divine spark within this seemingly abandoned child, and they saw the great destiny that lay before him. With infinite tenderness, they lifted him from the waters and brought him to their celestial realm. There, in the space between sky and sea, between day and night, the child was given the name Maui Tikitikiaturanga. Maui, meaning left side or left hand, perhaps referring to his position as the youngest, or perhaps hinting at his future as one who would approach problems from unexpected angles. Tiki Tiki, referring to the top knot of hair that had bound him, and Adaranga, marking him forever as the son of his mortal mother, though he would be raised by gods. The celestial beings who adopted Maui recognized that he was destined to serve as a bridge between the divine and mortal worlds. They understood that his mixed heritage was not a curse but a gift, allowing him to understand both the needs of humanity and the power of the gods. Under their guidance, he would learn the great arts of magic and shapeshifting, the secrets of the elements, and the ancient knowledge that would allow him to perform feats that would benefit all mankind. As Maui grew in the celestial realm, his mischievous nature became apparent early. He possessed an insatiable curiosity about everything in the cosmos, and a tendency to test boundaries that often led to spectacular consequences. His divine foster parents soon realized that they had not merely adopted a child, but had taken responsibility for a force of nature, one who would reshape the very world through his actions. Part 2: The Divine Education. In the radiant halls of his divine foster parents, young Maui received an education unlike any other child in the history of the Pacific Islands. His grandfather, Tamanuitera the sun god, taught him the secrets of light and energy, showing him how to harness the power that drives all life on Earth. Under the blazing tutelage of the sun, Maui learned to understand the rhythms of day and night, the cycles of the seasons, and the vital importance of light in sustaining all living things. These lessons took place in a realm where time moved differently than in the mortal world. A single day of instruction might encompass years of earthly time, and Maui absorbed knowledge with the incredible hunger that would characterize all his endeavors. Tamanuitera would take his grandson on journeys across the sky, showing him how the sun's path affected the growth of plants, the movements of ocean currents, and the behavior of all creatures below. From these aerial perspectives, Maui began to develop his deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all things in the natural world. He saw how the smallest changes in the sun's behavior could affect entire ecosystems, how the interplay between light and shadow created the conditions for life to flourish. This cosmic perspective would later inform his most famous exploits, as he learned to see the world not as separate, isolated elements, but as a vast, interconnected system that could be influenced through careful intervention. His grandmother, Hina Kukahi the moon goddess, provided a different but equally valuable education. Where the sun god taught power and dramatic transformation, the moon goddess taught subtlety, patience, and the deeper mysteries of cycles and renewal. Under her silver guidance, Maui learned the arts of shapeshifting, discovering that true power often lay not in overwhelming force, but in the ability to adapt and change according to circumstances. Hina Kukahi showed him how the moon's phases corresponded to the rhythms of the ocean, how the tides responded to her celestial dance, and how all life on the islands below synchronized itself to her gentle but inexorable influence. From her, Maui inherited his famous ability to take on different forms, a skill that would prove essential in his future adventures. She taught him to become a bird to soar above the islands, a fish to explore the depths of the ocean, and even to take on the appearance of other people when necessary. But perhaps most importantly, both divine grandparents recognized that Maui's greatest strength lay in his position between worlds. They taught him that his mixed heritage was not something to be ashamed of or overcome, but rather his greatest asset. As someone who belonged fully neither to the divine realm nor to the mortal world, he could serve as a mediator, a translator of divine will into human understanding, and an agent of change that neither purely divine nor purely mortal beings could accomplish. The other gods and spirits who inhabited the celestial realm watched Maui's education with great interest and not a little concern. They recognized his potential for both great good and great mischief, and many debates took place in the divine councils about how best to guide this unprecedented being. Some advocated for strict control and limitation of his powers, fearing that his impulsive nature might lead to catastrophic consequences. Others argued that his unique position required him to have extraordinary freedom to act according to his judgment. During this period of divine education, Maui also began to develop the tools and powers that would make him legendary. His grandfather forged for him a magical fishhook named Maniakalani, created from the bone of a divine ancestor and imbued with the power to catch more than mere fish. This hook would become Maui's most famous possession, capable of hooking onto abstract concepts like the sun itself, or solid objects like entire islands resting on the ocean floor. The hook was not merely a tool but a symbol of Maui's unique relationship with the ocean and its mysteries. Unlike ordinary fishing implements, Maniakalani was semi-sentient, able to sense the desires and intentions of its wielder and to act accordingly. It could stretch to impossible lengths, become as light as a feather or as heavy as a mountain, and could hook onto things that existed in spiritual as well as physical dimensions. As part of his training, Maui was also taught the ancient chants and incantations that would allow him to amplify his natural powers. These were not mere words, but sacred formulae that had been passed down through generations of divine beings, each syllable carefully crafted to resonate with the fundamental forces of creation. When spoken correctly, these chants could bend reality itself, allowing the speaker to accomplish seemingly impossible feats. The education also included extensive training in strategy and tactics, for the gods recognized that Maui's impulsive nature needed to be balanced with careful planning if his interventions in the mortal world were to be successful. They taught him to think several steps ahead, to consider the long-term consequences of his actions, and to understand that even well-intentioned interventions could have unintended effects that might harm the very people he sought to help. Yet despite all this divine instruction, Maui retained his fundamentally mischievous nature. He delighted in finding unexpected solutions to problems, in approaching challenges from angles that no one else would consider, and in pushing boundaries to see what would happen. His divine foster parents learned to balance their desire to guide him with respect for his need to discover things for himself, even when those discoveries led to spectacular failures or unintended consequences. Part 3: The Reunion with Mortality. As Maui grew in power and wisdom within the celestial realm, he became increasingly aware of a deep longing that no amount of divine knowledge could satisfy. Despite the love and guidance of his celestial foster parents, he felt an inexplicable pull toward the mortal world, a yearning to understand the humanity that flowed through his veins from his mother Terana. This restlessness grew stronger with each passing season, until finally his divine grandparents recognized that the time had come for him to explore his mortal heritage. The decision to allow Maui to descend to the mortal realm was not made lightly by the divine council. Many of the gods worried about the potential consequences of unleashing such a powerful being into the world of humans, where his actions could have far-reaching effects on entire populations. However, Tamanuitera and Hina Kokahi argued persuasively that Maui's ultimate destiny lay in serving as a bridge between worlds, and that this service could only be fulfilled through direct experience of mortal life. Before his descent, Maui was given final instructions and warnings by his divine foster parents. They reminded him that while his powers were great, they came with corresponding responsibilities, and that every action in the mortal realm would have consequences that rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. They also warned him that mortals, unlike gods, were fragile and that their lives were brief, making it essential for him to consider the human cost of any intervention he might make. Tamanuitera gave Maui a special gift for his journey into mortality, the ability to recognize divine essence wherever he encountered it. This would allow him to identify other beings with supernatural origins, to sense the presence of gods and spirits even when they were disguised or hidden, and to understand when he was dealing with forces beyond normal human comprehension. This gift would prove invaluable in his future adventures, helping him navigate the complex relationships between the divine and mortal worlds. Hina Kokahi's parting gift was equally precious, the power of true sight, which would allow him to perceive the deeper truth behind appearances. This meant he could see through illusions and deceptions, understand the true nature of problems that might appear simple on the surface, and recognize the hidden connections that linked seemingly unrelated events. This ability would make him not just a powerful hero, but a wise one, capable of addressing root causes rather than merely symptoms. When the time came for his departure from the celestial realm, Maui chose to approach the mortal world not with fanfare and divine proclamation, but quietly and humbly, seeking first to understand before seeking to be understood. He took the form of an ordinary young man and descended to the islands where his mother Terranah now lived with her family. Years had passed since that stormy night when she had cast her newborn into the sea, and she had given birth to 4 other sons who had grown to become respected members of their community. Maui's arrival in the village was deliberately unremarkable. He presented himself as a traveler from distant islands, seeking shelter and perhaps work in exchange for food and lodging. His brothers, Maui Mua, Maui Roto, Maui Taha, and Maui Pei, received him with the traditional hospitality that was sacred throughout Polynesian culture, never suspecting that this stranger was their long-lost sibling. For several days, Maui lived among his family without revealing his true identity, observing their daily routines, their challenges, and their relationships with careful attention. He saw how hard they worked to provide food for their community, spending long hours fishing in outrigger canoes that ventured far from shore in search of the schools of fish that sustained island life. He witnessed their struggles with unpredictable weather, with periods when the fish seemed to disappear entirely, and with the constant uncertainty that characterized life on small, isolated islands. During this time of observation, Maui also began to understand the personality and character of his mortal family. His brothers were good men, hard-working and devoted to their community, but they lacked the divine spark that burned within him. They approached problems with the practical, straightforward methods that had served their people for generations, never imagining that there might be extraordinary solutions available to extraordinary problems. His mother Terranah remained a figure of beauty and wisdom in the community, but Maui could see the shadow of old sorrow that she carried with her. Though she had never spoken openly of the child she had abandoned to the sea, her eyes sometimes carried a distant look when she gazed toward the horizon, and Maui sensed that part of her had never stopped wondering about the fate of that storm-born infant. The revelation of Maui's identity came about through a seemingly simple incident that would become legendary throughout the Pacific Islands. During a community gathering where food was being distributed according to traditional protocols, Maui noticed that he had been overlooked in the allocation. Rather than complaining or drawing attention to the oversight, he quietly took his place at the end of the line, accepting whatever portion might remain after everyone else had been served. However, when his turn finally came, something extraordinary happened. As he reached for the food, his divine nature briefly manifested, and everyone present saw him for a moment not as an ordinary traveler, but as a being of radiant power whose very presence seemed to charge the air with electric potential. The recognition spread through the gathering like wildfire, and soon everyone was staring at this stranger who was clearly no ordinary mortal. Maui's response was gentle but firm. "I am indeed your son, mother, though I am also much more than that. The sea you gave me to became my pathway to the divine realm, where I was raised and educated by beings of great power. I have returned not to claim a place in this family through birth, but to earn one through service. I am here to help our people face the challenges that lie ahead." Part 4: The First Miracles. The revelation of Maui's divine heritage created a sensation throughout the island community, but it also presented immediate challenges that would test both his powers and his wisdom. Some of the villagers were awed and eager to benefit from the presence of a demigod among them, while others were suspicious and fearful of what his supernatural abilities might mean for their traditional way of life. Maui recognized that he would need to prove himself not through displays of raw power, but through actions that genuinely benefited his adopted community. The first opportunity to demonstrate his worth came during a period of unusual hardship that had befallen the islands. For several weeks, the fishing had been poor, with the nets and lines of even the most skilled fishermen coming up empty day after day. The fish that normally provided the primary source of protein for the community seemed to have vanished entirely, and families were beginning to worry about how they would feed their children if the situation continued much longer. Maui's brothers approached him with a mixture of hope and skepticism, asking whether his supposed divine powers could help solve this crisis. They had always been practical men who relied on their own skills and hard work rather than supernatural intervention, but the severity of the situation was forcing them to consider options they might normally dismiss. Maui listened carefully to their concerns and agreed to accompany them on their next fishing expedition, though he warned them that his methods might be unlike anything they had previously experienced. Early the next morning, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of golden coral, Maui joined his brothers in their outrigger canoe and paddled out into the deep waters beyond the reef. The ocean was calm and beautiful, its surface broken only by the gentle swells that rolled in from the distant horizon, but beneath this peaceful appearance lay the mystery of where all the fish had gone. Maui's brothers cast their nets and dropped their lines in the spots that had always been most productive, but once again their efforts yielded nothing. After watching his brother's traditional techniques fail repeatedly, Maui quietly produced his magical fishhook Maniakalani and began to prepare it for use. The hook gleamed with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the ocean waves, and as Maui held it, the other men in the canoe could feel the air around them beginning to thrum with supernatural energy. Even the ocean itself seemed to respond to the presence of the divine implement, with the waves taking on a more regular, purposeful pattern. Rather than using ordinary bait, Maui bit his own lip and allowed several drops of his divine blood to fall onto the hook. This was not merely a practical decision, but a symbolic one, representing his willingness to sacrifice something of himself for the benefit of others. The blood of a demigod carried within it the essence of both mortal life and divine power, creating an irresistible lure for creatures that existed in the liminal space between ordinary reality and the supernatural realm. When Maui cast his line into the deep blue waters, several extraordinary things happened simultaneously. First, the line extended far beyond what should have been possible given the physical constraints of the fishing equipment, stretching down into depths that no normal hook could reach. Second, the hook began to glow even more brightly as it descended, creating a column of soft light that penetrated the darkest regions of the ocean. Finally, every creature in the surrounding waters began to respond to the supernatural presence of Maniakalani. The fish that had been hiding in the deepest trenches and caves, driven there by some disturbance in the natural order, began to emerge from their hiding places. Schools of tuna, mahi-mahi, and other food fish started swimming toward the magical hook, drawn not by hunger but by the irresistible call of divine power. Even creatures that normally lived at crushing depths began to rise toward the surface, creating a spectacular display of marine life that none of the men in the canoe had ever witnessed. As fish began to bite the magical hook, Maui demonstrated another aspect of his supernatural abilities. Rather than hauling them in one at a time, as would be done with ordinary fishing equipment, he was able to use Maniakalani to coordinate the movements of entire schools of fish. With careful manipulation of the magical line, he guided hundreds of fish directly into the nets that his brothers had cast, filling them so completely that the men worried the nets might break under the weight. But Maui's demonstration went beyond simply solving the immediate problem of food scarcity. As he worked with his magical hook, he also began to teach his brothers about the deeper mysteries of the ocean and its inhabitants. He explained how the fish had been driven into hiding by disturbances in the spiritual realm, conflicts between sea spirits that had made the normal fishing grounds temporarily uninhabitable for marine life. Using his divine sight, Maui was able to perceive the root cause of the fishing crisis, a dispute between Tangaroa, the great sea god, and Tawiri, the god of winds and storms. Their conflict had created chaotic spiritual currents that had disrupted the normal patterns of ocean life, driving the fish into the deepest waters where they felt safer from the supernatural turbulence above. To address this underlying problem, Maui performed a complex ritual while continuing to fish, chanting ancient words of power that served as a form of diplomatic communication with the warring deities. He offered himself as a mediator, using his unique position as a being who belonged to both divine and mortal realms to propose a resolution that would satisfy both parties while restoring harmony to the ocean ecosystem. The success of this intervention was immediately apparent. Not only did the fish continue to come to their nets in unprecedented numbers, but the entire character of the ocean began to change. The waters became clearer and more vibrant, the currents more regular and predictable, and even the weather patterns started to stabilize in ways that would benefit all the island communities in the region. When the canoe returned to shore, laden with more fish than the community had seen in months, word of Maui's miraculous intervention spread quickly throughout the islands. People came from neighboring villages to witness the incredible catch and to hear first-hand accounts of the supernatural fishing expedition. But more importantly, they came to understand that Maui's presence among them represented something unprecedented, a divine being who was willing and able to address not just the symptoms of their problems, but the underlying spiritual causes. This first demonstration of Maui's powers established several important precedents that would characterize all his future interventions. First, he showed that his abilities were not meant to replace human effort, but to amplify and enhance it. His brothers still had to cast their nets and paddle their canoe. Maui simply made their efforts more effective by addressing the supernatural obstacles that had been preventing their success. Second, he demonstrated that true solutions often required addressing problems at multiple levels simultaneously, dealing with both practical and spiritual dimensions. The fishing miracle also revealed Maui's approach to using his powers responsibly. Rather than creating a permanent dependency on divine intervention, he used the occasion to teach his brothers and the community about the deeper forces that affected their daily lives. He showed them how to recognize the signs of spiritual disturbance that might affect fishing, and he taught them rituals and offerings that could help maintain harmony between their activities and the supernatural beings who controlled the ocean's bounty. Part 5: The Quest for Fire. In the days following his miraculous intervention with the fishing crisis, Maui's reputation as a powerful and benevolent demigod spread throughout the island chains like ripples across still water. People came from great distances to seek his help with problems that had seemed insurmountable, and in each case, they found that he approached their difficulties with a combination of divine power and practical wisdom that produced results beyond their wildest hopes. Yet even as he helped others, Maui was beginning to perceive a much larger challenge that threatened all of humanity across the Pacific Islands. The people of the islands had long depended on fire for cooking their food, providing warmth during cool nights, and creating the tools and implements that made civilized life possible. However, their access to fire was precarious and unreliable, dependent on keeping existing flames alive through careful tending, or on the rare occasions when lightning strikes or volcanic activity provided new sources of ignition. When fires were accidentally extinguished by storms or carelessness, entire communities might be left without this essential element for days or weeks. Maui observed that this dependency on fire, combined with the difficulty of obtaining it reliably, created a form of suffering that affected every aspect of human life. Families would go hungry when they could not cook their food properly, children would shiver through cold nights when fires went out unexpectedly, and communities would be forced to abandon important activities when they lacked the fire necessary to forge tools or prepare materials. Using his divine sight, Maui perceived that the root of this problem lay in the realm of the gods, where fire was closely guarded by supernatural beings who viewed it as too powerful and dangerous to be freely available to mortals. The primary keeper of fire was Mahuika, the goddess of fire and lightning, who lived in the underworld and controlled all flames throughout the universe. She had decreed that mortals should have only limited access to fire, believing that unrestricted use of this element might lead them to challenge the gods themselves. This situation presented Maui with one of his greatest challenges yet, for obtaining fire for humanity would require him to venture into the underworld and confront a goddess whose power in her own realm was virtually unlimited. Moreover, he would need to convince her to change a policy that had been in place since the beginning of time, overturning precedents that had shaped the relationship between divine and mortal realms for countless generations. After careful consideration and extensive consultation with his divine foster parents, Maui decided that the benefits to humanity justified the risks involved in this quest. He understood that reliable access to fire would not only alleviate immediate suffering but would also enable human civilization to advance in ways that would bring them closer to their full potential. With fire readily available, people could develop new technologies, explore new forms of art and expression, and create communities that were more resilient and prosperous. The journey to Mahuika's realm in the underworld required Maui to employ all of his shape-shifting abilities and his knowledge of interdimensional travel. He could not simply walk into the underworld as he might visit another island, for the realm of the dead and the spirits was separated from the world of the living by barriers that could only be crossed by those who possessed special knowledge and power. First, Maui transformed himself into a spirit form that could exist in the underworld without being immediately detected as a living intruder. This transformation was more complex than his usual shapeshifting, requiring him to temporarily separate his consciousness from his physical body while maintaining enough connection to ensure that he could return to mortality when his mission was complete. The process was dangerous, for if the connection was severed completely, his consciousness might become trapped in the spirit realm forever. The entrance to Mahuika's domain was located beneath the most active volcano in the island chain, accessible only through a series of lava tubes that descended deep into the Earth's molten core. As Maui descended through these tunnels, the temperature rose to levels that would have been instantly fatal to any ordinary mortal, but his divine heritage protected him from the extreme heat while still allowing him to feel the awesome power of the volcanic forces around him. The underworld itself proved to be a realm of incredible beauty and terrible danger, filled with landscapes that defied ordinary understanding. Rivers of molten lava flowed like water through caverns decorated with crystals that had been formed by eons of heat and pressure. Gardens of flame flowers bloomed in areas where the temperature was so high that ordinary matter could not exist, and the air itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the Earth's heartbeat. When Maui presented himself before Mahuika, he chose not to rely on deception or trickery, but instead to approach her with honesty and respect. He acknowledged her power and authority over fire, praised her wisdom in maintaining the balance between divine and mortal realms, and then carefully presented his case for why humanity deserved greater access to this precious element. The goddess listened to Maui's petition with growing interest, for she had never before encountered a being who could speak to her as an equal while also representing mortal interests with such eloquence and understanding. She recognized that his unique position as a demigod gave him insights that neither purely divine nor purely mortal beings could possess, and she began to consider the possibility that her long-standing policies regarding fire might indeed need to be reconsidered. However, Mahuika was not prepared to simply grant Maui's request without testing both his worthiness and his understanding of the responsibilities that would come with such a gift. She proposed a series of challenges that would demonstrate his ability to handle fire safely and wisely, and his commitment to ensuring that humans would use this power for constructive rather than destructive purposes. The first challenge required Maui to prove that he could control fire rather than simply use it. Mahuika created a massive inferno that threatened to consume everything in the immediate area, then commanded Maui to contain it without extinguishing it completely. This task required him to understand fire not as a simple tool, but as a living force with its own will and intelligence that had to be negotiated with rather than dominated. Using a combination of his divine powers and his deep understanding of elemental forces, Maui was able to communicate with the fire itself, persuading it to limit its expansion while maintaining its essential vitality. He demonstrated that he understood fire as a partner rather than a slave, showing the respect and wisdom that would be necessary for humans to maintain a healthy relationship with this powerful element. Part 6: The Gift of Eternal Flame. The second challenge that Mahuika presented to Maui was even more complex than the first, designed to test not only his power but his wisdom and foresight. She created a scenario in which he was given control of all the fire in the mortal world for a single day, during which time he would be responsible for every flame, every cooking fire, every torch that provided light in the darkness. If any fire caused harm during this period, or if any community suffered from lack of fire when they needed it, his quest would be deemed a failure. This challenge required Maui to think on a scale that few beings, even among the gods, had ever contemplated. He had to simultaneously monitor thousands of fires across hundreds of islands, ensuring that each flame served its intended purpose without causing unintended destruction. The task demanded not only supernatural awareness but also an intimate understanding of human needs and behavior that could only come from his unique position as a being who belonged to both divine and mortal realms. Throughout that extraordinary day, Maui demonstrated abilities that impressed even Mahuika herself. When a cooking fire in one village began to spread toward nearby homes, he was able to redirect it harmlessly while ensuring that the family's meal was still properly prepared. When fishermen on a distant island found their signal fire extinguished by an unexpected storm, he rekindled it instantly, enabling them to guide their canoes safely back to shore. The third and final challenge was the most profound, requiring Maui to demonstrate not his power over fire, but his commitment to using that power responsibly. Mahuika presented him with a choice: he could receive a single flame that would never die, which he could share with humanity to end their fire-gathering struggles forever, or he could receive the knowledge of how to create fire at will, which would give him personal power but would require him to be present whenever humans needed this assistance. This choice was designed to reveal Maui's true character and priorities. The eternal flame would benefit humanity most directly, but it would also reduce his own importance and power in their lives. The knowledge of fire creation would make him indispensable to human communities, ensuring his status as a hero and provider for all time. Lesser beings might have chosen personal glory over general benefit, but Maui's response revealed the wisdom that his divine education had instilled in him. Without hesitation, Maui chose the eternal flame, explaining to Mahuika that his purpose was not to make himself indispensable to humanity, but to enable them to become more self-sufficient and capable. He understood that true heroism lay not in creating dependency but in providing tools and knowledge that would allow others to solve their own problems. The eternal flame would give humans the security and reliability they needed to develop their civilizations while maintaining their independence and dignity. Impressed by this display of wisdom and selflessness, Mahuika agreed to grant Maui's request, but she also insisted on adding her own safeguards to ensure that the gift would be used properly. She imbued the eternal flame with a form of spiritual intelligence that would allow it to recognize the intentions of those who sought to use it. The flame would burn brightly and steadily for constructive purposes, but it would resist being used for warfare, destruction, or other harmful activities. The goddess also taught Maui the proper rituals and ceremonies that humans should perform when receiving fire from the eternal flame, not as requirements that would limit their access, but as expressions of respect and gratitude that would help maintain the proper relationship between humanity and this powerful element. These rituals would also serve as reminders of the responsibilities that came with the use of fire, helping to prevent the careless accidents that could cause great harm. Before Maui departed from the underworld, Mahuika offered him one additional gift: the knowledge of fire's deeper mysteries, including advanced techniques for metalworking, glassmaking, and other technologies that would become possible when humans had reliable access to high-temperature flames. This knowledge would not be immediately useful, but it would become invaluable as human civilizations advanced and developed the sophistication necessary to employ these techniques safely and effectively. The journey back to the surface world with the eternal flame proved to be almost as challenging as the original descent to Mahuika's realm. The flame itself was not heavy in any physical sense, but it carried within it a spiritual weight that represented the enormous responsibility Maui was undertaking on behalf of all humanity. Moreover, the transition between realms required him to carefully modulate his spiritual form to ensure that the divine flame could exist in the mortal world without losing its essential properties. The introduction of the eternal flame to human society created changes that rippled outward through generations and across vast distances. Communities that had lived with the constant fear of losing their fires could now plan long-term projects that required sustained heat. Artisans could develop new techniques for pottery, metalwork, and other crafts that had previously been impossible due to the unreliability of their heat sources. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological effect of having reliable fire transformed human civilization in ways that went far beyond mere practical applications. The security of knowing that light and warmth would always be available freed people to explore new forms of creativity, to engage in philosophical and spiritual pursuits that had been difficult when so much energy had to be devoted to the basic necessities of survival. Maui established protocols for sharing the eternal flame that ensured it would reach all communities throughout the island chains while preventing any single group from hoarding this precious resource. He created a network of flamekeepers, individuals trained in the proper care and distribution of fire, who would carry portions of the eternal flame to distant islands and teach local communities how to maintain their own perpetual fires. The success of the fire quest established Maui's reputation not just as a powerful demigod, but as a wise and benevolent leader whose interventions genuinely improved the lives of those he served. This reputation would prove crucial in his future endeavors, for the challenges that lay ahead would require not only supernatural power but also the trust and cooperation of human communities across the Pacific. Part 7: Snaring the Sun. With the gift of eternal fire secured for humanity, Maui's reputation as a benefactor and miracle worker spread across the vast Pacific like the morning sun itself. Yet even as communities celebrated their newfound security and prosperity, Maui was already perceiving another fundamental problem that limited human potential and caused unnecessary suffering throughout the islands. The issue was one that affected every aspect of daily life, yet was so basic and seemingly immutable that most people had never imagined it could be changed: the shortness of the day. In those ancient times, the sun raced across the sky with such speed that people barely had enough daylight hours to complete their essential tasks. Farmers struggled to tend their crops before darkness fell, fishermen found their productive hours severely limited, and artisans working with the eternal flame could barely begin their projects before being forced to work by artificial light alone. The rapid passage of the sun created a constant sense of urgency that prevented people from developing their full potential or enjoying the fruits of their labor. Maui observed that this problem was particularly acute for the elderly, the disabled, and others who could not work as quickly as younger, stronger individuals. They found themselves perpetually behind, unable to complete necessary tasks within the brief span of daylight available to them. Children, too, suffered from the sun's haste, as they had little time to play and learn during the precious hours when outdoor activities were possible. Using his divine sight, Maui perceived that the sun's excessive speed was not a natural or necessary characteristic, but rather the result of Te-Are, the sun god, having grown complacent in his celestial duties. In the early days of creation, Te-Are had moved across the sky at a measured pace that provided adequate daylight for all living things. However, over the eons, he had begun to rush through his daily journey, eager to complete his work quickly so that he could spend more time in leisure pursuits with the other celestial beings. This revelation presented Maui with perhaps his greatest challenge yet, for it would require him to confront and restrain a major deity whose power was fundamental to the continuation of life itself. Unlike his negotiations with Mahuika, which had been conducted through diplomacy and mutual respect, this intervention would necessarily involve a degree of coercion, since Te-Are had shown no interest in voluntarily changing his behavior despite the hardship it caused mortals. After extensive consultation with his divine foster parents and careful observation of the sun's daily patterns, Maui developed a plan that was audacious even by his own standards. He would create a massive snare capable of catching and holding the sun, forcing Te-Are to negotiate for his release while demonstrating the seriousness of humanity's need for longer days. The plan required not only supernatural crafting skills but also precise timing and the cooperation of human allies who would help him position the trap correctly. The creation of a snare capable of holding the sun required materials and techniques that pushed the boundaries of even divine craftsmanship. Maui began by gathering fibers from the strongest plants on the islands, but these ordinary materials, no matter how expertly woven, would be instantly destroyed by the sun's immense heat and energy. Instead, he would need to create a rope imbued with supernatural properties that could withstand direct contact with divine fire. Working in secret over the course of several months, Maui gathered hair from his mortal relatives, including strands from his own head and those freely given by his brothers and mother. Human hair, he understood, carried within it the essence of mortal determination and the connection between divine and earthly realms that flowed through his own mixed heritage. When properly prepared and blessed, these fibers could be transformed into a material strong enough to bind even a god. The process of creating the divine rope required Maui to employ skills he had learned from both his celestial and mortal families. From the gods, he had learned the incantations and rituals necessary to imbue ordinary materials with supernatural properties. From his human relatives, he had learned the traditional crafts of rope-making and net-weaving that were essential for island life. The combination of these knowledge systems created something unprecedented, a tool that belonged fully to neither realm but drew its power from both. As he worked, Maui also began preparing his human allies for the role they would play in this extraordinary endeavor. He explained to his brothers and other trusted community members that the success of the plan would depend not only on supernatural power but on careful coordination and timing. Each person would need to understand their specific responsibilities and be prepared to act with precision when the moment came to deploy the snare. The location chosen for the sun snaring attempt was a high peak on the largest island in the chain, a place where the sun passed relatively close to the earth during its daily journey. This mountain was considered sacred by local communities, who believed it to be a dwelling place of spirits and a point of connection between the terrestrial and celestial realms. Gaining permission to use this site for his plan required Maui to engage in lengthy negotiations with local spiritual leaders and to demonstrate that his intentions were purely beneficial. The positioning of the snare required extraordinary precision, for Maui would have only one opportunity to catch the sun before Te became aware of the trap and potentially changed his route to avoid it. Working with his human allies, Maui spent days calculating the exact trajectory of the sun's path and determining the optimal placement for each component of the elaborate trap he had constructed. The snare itself was a masterpiece of supernatural engineering, designed not simply to stop the sun but to do so in a way that would not cause catastrophic disruption to the natural order. Rather than attempting to halt Te completely, which could have plunged the world into darkness or caused other cosmic disasters, the trap was designed to slow the sun's movement gradually, allowing for negotiation while maintaining the basic patterns of day and night. On the appointed morning, as Te began his usual hasty journey across the sky, Maui and his allies took their positions around the carefully constructed snare. The tension was extraordinary, for everyone involved understood that they were attempting something that had never been tried before in the history of the world. If they succeeded, they would change the fundamental conditions of life for all humanity. If they failed, they might face the wrath of one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon. The moment of truth came as Te approached the carefully calculated point in his celestial journey. With perfect timing, Maui activated the snare, and the magical rope shot out to encircle the sun god with bands of divine power that tightened with each movement he made to escape. The sky filled with brilliant flashes of light as Te struggled against his bonds, and the very air seemed to crackle with the energy of divine conflict. As the sun found himself trapped and unable to continue his headlong rush across the sky, his initial reaction was one of rage and indignation. How dare these mortals, led by an upstart demigod, presume to interfere with the cosmic order and restrict the movements of a deity whose authority had been established since the beginning of time? Te-Ra's fury manifested as intense heat and blinding light that would have been instantly fatal to any ordinary mortals in the area. However, Maui had prepared for this reaction, and his divine heritage protected both himself and his human allies from the worst effects of the sun god's wrath. More importantly, he was ready with carefully prepared words that transformed what could have been a confrontation into a negotiation. Rather than gloating over his successful capture of Te or making demands from a position of strength, Maui approached the trapped sun god with respect and a clear explanation of the human suffering that had motivated his drastic action. The negotiation that followed would become legendary throughout Polynesian culture, representing the power of reasoned discourse to resolve even the most seemingly intractable conflicts. Maui explained to Te how the rapid passage of the sun affected every aspect of human life, describing specific examples of hardship and lost potential that resulted from insufficient daylight hours. He emphasized that he was not seeking to diminish Te-Ra's power or status, but simply to encourage a more measured pace that would benefit all living things. Part 8: The Bargain of Daylight. As Te hung suspended in Maui's divine snare, caught between earth and heaven like a brilliant jewel in a net of starlight, the sun god began to understand that this unprecedented situation required more than mere divine authority to resolve. The young demigod who had dared to restrain him spoke not with the arrogance of a challenger seeking to usurp power, but with the wisdom of one who genuinely understood the cosmic balance and the needs of all living things. Maui's approach to the negotiation demonstrated the profound education he had received from his divine foster parents, as well as the practical wisdom he had gained from living among mortals. Rather than simply listing human complaints against the sun's behavior, he helped Te see the situation from perspectives that the god had never considered. He painted vivid word pictures of families struggling to complete their work before darkness fell, of children who barely had time to play in the sunlight, of elderly people whose slower pace meant they lived most of their lives in artificial twilight. More significantly, Maui helped Te-Ara understand how his hasty journey across the sky was actually diminishing his own glory and importance. When the sun raced overhead so quickly that people barely had time to appreciate its warmth and light, they took its benefits for granted. By slowing his pace and allowing mortals to more fully experience the gifts of daylight, Te-Ara would actually increase their gratitude and reverence, enhancing rather than reducing his status among both gods and humans. This argument appealed to Te-Ra's pride in a way that threats or demands never could have, for it showed him that changing his behavior would serve his own interests as well as those of mortals. The sun god began to see that his rush across the sky had indeed become an empty routine that brought him little satisfaction and even less recognition. By taking the time to properly fulfill his role as the bringer of light and life, he could rediscover the meaning and purpose that had originally made his celestial duties a source of pride rather than burden. However, Te-Ara also raised legitimate concerns about the practical implications of slowing his daily journey. The cosmic order was a delicate system in which every element had to maintain its proper relationship with every other element. If he changed his pace significantly, it might disrupt the cycles of the moon, the patterns of the tides, and countless other natural phenomena that depended on the sun's current schedule. Maui was prepared for these concerns, having spent considerable time studying the interconnections between celestial movements and natural cycles. He proposed a carefully calibrated solution that would slow the sun's journey enough to provide meaningful relief to humans while maintaining the essential rhythms that governed the broader cosmos. Rather than a dramatic change that could cause widespread disruption, he suggested a gradual adjustment that would allow all other systems to adapt smoothly to the new pace. To demonstrate his understanding of these complex relationships, Maui shared knowledge that impressed even Te-Ara with its depth and sophistication. He showed how the longer days he proposed would actually enhance the growth of plants, improve the productivity of fishing and farming, and create conditions that would allow human civilization to flourish in ways that would ultimately benefit the gods themselves through increased worship, art, and spiritual development. The negotiation also addressed Te-Ra's concern about setting a precedent that might encourage other mortals to attempt similar interventions with divine beings. Maui acknowledged that his actions were extraordinary and unprecedented, explaining that they were justified only by the exceptional nature of the problem and his own unique position as a being who belonged to both divine and mortal realms. He assured Te-Ara that he had no intention of encouraging others to follow his example unless they faced equally fundamental problems and possessed similar abilities to address them safely. As the discussion continued, Te-Ara found himself genuinely enjoying this intellectual exchange with a being who could match his divine perspective while also bringing insights that no purely celestial being could provide. The sun god began to realize that his isolation in the celestial realm had limited his understanding of his own importance and effectiveness. Maui's intervention, though initially outrageous, was providing him with valuable information about the impact of his actions that would help him fulfill his cosmic role more effectively. Eventually, the negotiation reached a point where both parties were ready to discuss specific terms for a new arrangement. Te-Ara agreed to slow his daily journey by a significant margin, providing humans with substantially longer days while still maintaining the basic rhythm of day and night that was essential to the cosmic order. In exchange, Maui agreed to release the sun god from his snare and to work with human communities to establish new rituals and ceremonies that would properly honor Te-Ra's enhanced role in their lives. The agreement also included provisions for future communication between Te-Ara and humanity, mediated by Maui when necessary. The sun god recognized that his previous isolation from mortal affairs had contributed to the problem they were now solving, and he agreed to be more attentive to the effects of his behavior on the living world below. This would help prevent similar crises in the future and ensure that the cosmic order continued to serve the needs of all beings, divine and mortal alike. As part of the bargain, Maui also negotiated for seasonal variations in daylight that would provide additional benefits to human activities. During the seasons when farming was most critical, the days would be longest, giving agricultural communities the maximum time to plant, tend, and harvest their crops. During other seasons, the days would be shorter but still longer than they had been previously, providing a rhythm that would enhance rather than hinder human productivity and happiness. When the terms were finally agreed upon, the release of Te Ara from Maui's divine snare was accompanied by a spectacular display of celestial light that could be seen across all the islands. The sun god, freed from his bonds but committed to his new pace, began to move across the sky with a majesty and deliberation that immediately made the benefits of the new arrangement apparent to everyone below. The longer days that resulted from Maui's intervention transformed human civilization across the Pacific Islands in ways that exceeded even his optimistic expectations. Farmers found that they could not only complete their necessary work during daylight hours but could also experiment with new crops and techniques that required more careful attention. Fishermen could extend their productive hours, leading to more abundant catches and greater food security for their communities. Artisans working with the eternal fire found that the combination of reliable heat and extended daylight allowed them to develop new crafts and technologies that had previously been impossible. The additional time available for creative pursuits led to an explosion of artistic expression, with new forms of sculpture, weaving, and decoration appearing throughout the islands. Children had more time for play and learning, leading to a generation that was more curious, more creative, and more capable than any that had come before. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological effects of longer days created a more optimistic and ambitious culture throughout the Pacific Islands. People who had previously lived with the constant pressure of racing against sunset now had time to contemplate longer-term goals and to pursue activities that brought joy rather than mere survival. The success of Maui's sun-snaring adventure became a powerful symbol that inspired people to believe that seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome through courage, wisdom, and determination. The new relationship between Te Ara and humanity, mediated by Maui's ongoing diplomatic efforts, also created a model for more positive interactions between divine and mortal realms. Other gods began to pay more attention to the effects of their actions on human communities, while humans developed new forms of worship and respect that acknowledged their dependence on divine benevolence while also asserting their right to live with dignity and opportunity. Part 9: The Great Fishing. With fire secured for all humanity and the sun's pace slowed to provide adequate daylight for human flourishing, Maui had already accomplished feats that would have secured his place in legend for all time. Yet the challenges facing the scattered island communities of the Pacific remained formidable, and the demigod's divine sight revealed problems that went beyond the immediate needs he had already addressed. The islands where people lived were small and limited in resources, often barely able to support their growing populations, while vast stretches of empty ocean separated communities that could benefit greatly from closer contact and cooperation. Maui observed that many of the difficulties faced by island communities stemmed from the simple fact that there was not enough land to support their needs and ambitions. Families were forced to crowd together in small spaces, fertile soil was scarce and had to be carefully conserved, and there was little room for expansion when communities grew or when people wanted to try new ways of living. The ocean, while providing fish and serving as a highway for travel, also created barriers that limited trade, cultural exchange, and the sharing of innovations between islands. The solution that began to form in Maui's mind was audacious even by his own standards, for it involved nothing less than the creation of new land where none had existed before. Using his divine sight, he could perceive that far beneath the ocean's surface lay vast masses of rock and earth that had never risen above the waves. These underwater lands possessed rich soil, fresh water springs, and all the resources necessary to support thriving communities, if only they could be brought to the surface. The idea of fishing up islands from the ocean floor represented a fusion of Maui's divine powers with the traditional skills and knowledge of his mortal heritage. Fishing was central to island culture, providing not only food but also serving as a metaphor for patience, skill, and the ability to bring valuable things up from hidden depths. By approaching the creation of new land as a form of fishing, Maui could employ both supernatural abilities and the practical wisdom that had been passed down through generations of island fishermen. The preparation for this unprecedented fishing expedition required Maui to consider challenges that went far beyond even his previous extraordinary adventures. The underwater lands he intended to raise were not simply heavy objects that needed to be pulled to the surface, but complex geological formations whose sudden emergence could create tidal waves, earthquakes, and other catastrophic disruptions if not handled with extreme care. Moreover, the act of creating new islands would necessarily alter the balance of forces in the ocean, potentially affecting currents, weather patterns, and marine ecosystems throughout the Pacific. Maui understood that he would need to proceed with a level of precision and foresight that would prevent his beneficial intervention from causing unintended harm to existing communities and natural systems. The planning phase of the Great Fishing Expedition involved extensive consultation with both divine and mortal advisors. From his celestial foster parents, Maui sought guidance on the cosmic implications of adding new land masses to the world, ensuring that his actions would harmonize with rather than disrupt the fundamental order of creation. From experienced fishermen among his human relatives, he learned about ocean currents, seasonal patterns, and the practical challenges of managing extremely large catches. Maui's magical fishhook, Maniakalani, would obviously be central to this endeavor, but even this divine implement would require enhancement to handle the unprecedented challenge of hooking and lifting entire landmasses. Working with supernatural craftsmen in the celestial realm, Maui reinforced the hook with additional divine materials and expanded its consciousness to give it the ability to understand and adapt to the unique requirements of geological fishing. The enhanced Maniakalani became more than just a tool, it developed into a partner that could extend its influence through vast underwater regions, locating the most suitable landmasses for raising and determining the optimal methods for bringing them to the surface without causing destructive side effects. The hook gained the ability to communicate with the geological forces beneath the ocean, negotiating with earth spirits and volcanic powers to ensure their cooperation in the great undertaking. The creation of this supernatural fishing line required Maui to travel to the boundaries of the known world, gathering materials from sources that existed at the intersection of different cosmic domains. Each component had to be carefully prepared and blessed to ensure compatibility with the others, and the entire line had to be woven according to patterns that reflected the underlying structure of reality itself. When completed, the fishing line possessed properties that seemed to violate ordinary physical laws. It could extend to any necessary length without becoming weaker, could bear unlimited weight without breaking, and could transmit not only physical forces but also spiritual and emotional energies between Maui and whatever he sought to catch. This last property would prove crucial, for the successful raising of islands would require not just brute force but also a form of communication and cooperation with the landmasses themselves. The island that Maui ultimately chose for his first attempt was a massive underwater mountain that rose from the deepest parts of the Pacific, crowned with fertile valleys and blessed with numerous fresh water sources. Its emergence would create a large, resource-rich landmass positioned perfectly to serve as a hub for trade and cultural exchange between existing island communities. Most importantly, geological surveys conducted with his enhanced divine sight indicated that the island could be safely raised without triggering destructive earthquakes or tidal waves. As the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern horizon, Maui began the complex series of chants and rituals that would prepare both himself and his divine fishing equipment for the unprecedented challenge ahead. These incantations served not only to focus his supernatural powers but also to establish communication with the various spiritual forces that would need to cooperate for the island fishing to succeed without causing catastrophic side effects. Part 10: The Rising of New Lands. The moment when Maui cast his divine fishing line into the depths of the Pacific marked the beginning of an event that would reshape both the physical geography of the ocean and the spiritual understanding of what was possible when divine power was wielded with wisdom and precision. As Maniakalani sank through the crystal-clear waters, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of countless island communities, the very ocean seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The descent of the magical hook through layers of ocean water revealed to Maui the incredible complexity of the marine world that existed beneath the surface. Schools of fish parted respectfully before the divine implement, as if recognizing its supernatural nature and the momentous purpose it served. Deep-sea creatures that had never seen sunlight emerged from their abyssal homes to witness this unprecedented event, their bioluminescent bodies creating a trail of living light that marked the hook's passage toward the ocean floor. As Maniakalani reached the deeper waters where pressure would have crushed any ordinary object, it began to resonate with the geological forces that shaped the ocean floor itself. The hook could sense the massive landmass that lay beneath miles of water and sediment, dormant but ready to rise if called upon by sufficient power and authority. The spiritual consciousness that Maui had awakened within his fishing implement allowed it to communicate with the earth spirits that dwelt within the underwater island, negotiating the terms under which they would cooperate in its elevation to the surface. The negotiation between Maniakalani and the spirits of the underwater island revealed the deep wisdom that guided all of Maui's interventions in the natural order. Rather than simply using brute force to drag the landmass upward, the divine hook sought to understand the island's own desires and purposes, discovering that it had long yearned to rise above the waves and provide a home for living creatures. This mutual desire for emergence created a partnership that would make the actual raising both safer and more effective than any attempt at coercion could have been. When Maniakalani finally made contact with the underwater island, the connection was felt not only by Maui but by every person in the fishing canoe and indeed by sensitive individuals throughout the Pacific region. The ocean began to behave in ways that defied ordinary understanding, with currents shifting to create a perfectly calm circle around the canoe while waters at a distance began to show unusual wave patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some vast, slow heartbeat. The process of actually raising the island required Maui to coordinate his divine strength with the natural forces that were already present in the ocean and the earth beneath it. Rather than simply pulling upward with supernatural power, he had to work with volcanic pressures, tectonic movements, and the complex dynamics of water displacement to ensure that the island's emergence would be both smooth and non-destructive. As the underwater landmass began its slow journey toward the surface, the effects became visible throughout the surrounding ocean. The water began to glow with an ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the rising island itself, and the temperature of the sea increased noticeably as geothermal energy from the landmass began to affect the marine environment. Fish and other sea creatures gathered in unprecedented numbers, as if drawn by some instinctive understanding that they were witnessing the birth of a new world. Maui's brothers and the other fishermen in the canoe watched with awe and not a little fear as their familiar ocean environment transformed around them. The sea that they had known all their lives, predictable in its moods and patterns, was revealing aspects of its nature that they had never imagined. Waves moved in directions that seemed to defy the wind, and the water itself took on properties that made it feel more like liquid light than ordinary seawater. The most challenging aspect of the island raising process came when the landmass approached the point where it would break through the ocean's surface. This transition required extraordinary delicacy, for the sudden emergence of such a large mass of land could create devastating tidal waves if not carefully managed. Maui had to modulate the speed and angle of the island's ascent to ensure that the displaced water would spread outward in gentle swells rather than destructive waves. When the peak of the underwater island finally broke through the surface of the ocean, the sight was so magnificent that it seemed to justify all the risks and efforts that had gone into the undertaking. What emerged was not a barren rock, but a fully formed landmass covered with rich soil and blessed with fresh water springs that bubbled up from deep underground sources. Vegetation that had somehow survived in underwater caves began to flourish in the sunlight, and the new island seemed to pulse with life-giving energy. The emergence continued for hours, revealing the true scope of what Maui had accomplished. The island that rose from the depths was larger than any of the existing landmasses in the region, with deep harbors that would shelter ships from storms, fertile valleys suitable for agriculture, and mineral deposits that would provide resources for generations of inhabitants. Most remarkably, the island seemed to have been designed by nature itself to serve as a perfect habitat for human communities. As the day progressed and the new island stabilized in its position above the waves, Maui began to observe the immediate effects of his intervention on the surrounding environment. The climate of the entire region was subtly altered by the presence of this new landmass, with wind patterns shifting to create more favorable conditions for both sailing and agriculture on nearby islands. Ocean currents were redirected in ways that would improve fishing throughout the area, and the overall productivity of the marine ecosystem was enhanced rather than diminished. Word of the miraculous island raising spread across the Pacific with remarkable speed, carried by birds, currents, and the mysterious forms of communication that connected island communities across vast distances. People came from hundreds of miles away to witness the new landmass and to understand how such an impossible thing could have been accomplished. Many brought offerings and requests, hoping that Maui might be persuaded to create additional islands that would solve their own community's problems with overcrowding and limited resources. However, Maui was careful to explain that the creation of new islands was not something that could be done casually or frequently. Each intervention of this magnitude required extensive preparation, careful consideration of environmental consequences, and the cooperation of numerous divine and natural forces. He emphasized that the new island was intended to serve all the communities of the region, not just those who might be first to claim residence there. The establishment of the first human settlements on the newly raised island became a model for cooperative community development that would influence Pacific cultures for generations to come. Rather than allowing the new land to be claimed by the strongest or most aggressive groups, Maui worked with traditional leaders from throughout the region to develop systems for fair allocation of territory and resources. Families from overcrowded islands were given opportunities to establish new homes on the fresh landmass, but only after demonstrating their commitment to sustainable practices that would preserve the island's natural abundance for future generations. Agricultural techniques were adapted to make the most of the rich volcanic soil without depleting it, and fishing practices were established that would maintain the productivity of the surrounding waters while taking advantage of the enhanced marine ecosystem created by the island's emergence. The success of the first island raising encouraged Maui to undertake additional fishing expeditions, each one carefully planned to address specific needs in different parts of the Pacific region. Over the course of several years, he raised a series of islands that formed a chain of new landmasses, each positioned to maximize benefits for existing communities while creating opportunities for expanded trade, cultural exchange, and population growth. Each new island that Maui brought up from the depths had its own unique characteristics and advantages. Some were blessed with particularly fertile soil that made them ideal for agriculture, others had natural harbors that would serve as centers for maritime trade, and still others possessed unique mineral resources or geographic features that would benefit the entire region. The diversity of these new lands reflected Maui's growing understanding of the complex needs of Pacific Island communities and his commitment to creating solutions that would serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The process of raising each successive island also became more refined and efficient as Maui gained experience with the complex forces involved in such massive geological manipulation. He developed new techniques for communicating with underwater landmasses, improved methods for coordinating with natural forces during the emergence process, and better systems for predicting and managing the environmental effects of each intervention. Part 11: The Wisdom of the Islands. The new islands, with their abundant resources and strategic locations, naturally attracted settlers from many different cultural backgrounds and island traditions. While this diversity brought valuable knowledge, skills, and perspectives to the developing communities, it also created tensions over how the islands should be governed, how resources should be distributed, and how conflicts between different groups should be resolved. Maui observed that his ability to create new land had been far easier than creating the social systems necessary for people to live together harmoniously on that land. The first major crisis arose on the largest of the newly raised islands, where 3 different cultural groups had established settlements in various parts of the landmass. Each group brought with them their own traditional systems of leadership, their own customs regarding property ownership, and their own spiritual practices and beliefs. While there was initially enough space and resources for all 3 communities to prosper without direct competition, growth in population and changes in environmental conditions eventually led to disputes over fishing rights, agricultural territories, and access to fresh water sources. The leaders of these communities, recognizing that their conflicts could escalate into warfare that would devastate the island they all called home, approached Maui for guidance in resolving their differences. However, they quickly discovered that the demigod who had successfully negotiated with gods and raised islands from the ocean floor was initially uncertain about how to address the complex interpersonal and cultural dynamics that were driving their disputes. This humbling experience taught Maui an important lesson about the limitations of supernatural power when confronted with fundamentally human problems. While his divine abilities allowed him to reshape the physical world in ways that benefited humanity, the creation of just and harmonious societies required different skills and different approaches. He realized that he needed to develop new forms of wisdom that could address the social and psychological aspects of human nature with the same effectiveness that his magical powers addressed physical challenges. Maui's approach to developing this new form of wisdom involved extensive travel throughout the Pacific region, visiting established island communities and observing how different cultures had developed systems for maintaining peace and cooperation among their members. He spent time with traditional councils of elders, learning about the decision-making processes they used to resolve disputes and allocate resources fairly. He observed religious ceremonies and spiritual practices that helped bind communities together through shared beliefs and rituals. From the island of wise navigators, Maui learned about the importance of establishing clear protocols and procedures that everyone could understand and follow, preventing conflicts that arose from confusion or misunderstanding about expectations and responsibilities. These navigators had developed detailed systems for coordinating complex voyages involving multiple canoes and crews, and their organizational methods could be adapted to help diverse communities work together effectively on land-based projects. On an island known for its skilled craftspeople, Maui discovered how communities could be organized around complementary specializations that made everyone interdependent rather than competitive. When different groups focused on becoming excellent at different essential skills, some specializing in fishing, others in agriculture, still others in toolmaking or spiritual leadership, they naturally developed relationships of mutual support rather than rivalry. The island of great storytellers taught Maui about the power of shared narratives to create common identity and purpose among diverse peoples. Communities that had developed rich traditions of oral history, mythology, and cultural stories found it easier to incorporate newcomers and resolve conflicts because everyone could see themselves as part of a larger, ongoing story that gave meaning to both individual struggles and collective achievements. Perhaps most importantly, Maui learned from an island where a devastating natural disaster had forced formerly separate communities to work together for survival. The experience of facing a common challenge that threatened everyone equally had broken down the barriers of mistrust and competition that had previously divided these groups. They had discovered that their differences in culture and tradition could be sources of strength rather than conflict when they were united by shared purpose and mutual dependence. Armed with these insights, Maui returned to the troubled island where the three communities were struggling to coexist peacefully. Rather than imposing a solution from his position of supernatural authority, he began by helping the different groups recognize their common interests and shared challenges. He organized joint projects that required cooperation between the communities, such as the construction of irrigation systems that would benefit everyone's agricultural efforts and the establishment of watch systems that would protect all the settlements from potential threats. Maui also worked to address the underlying fears and misunderstandings that were driving much of the conflict between the groups. Through carefully facilitated discussions, he helped community members from different backgrounds share their stories, explain their customs, and express their concerns about how changes might affect their traditional ways of life. These conversations revealed that many of the apparent conflicts were actually based on miscommunication and assumptions rather than fundamental incompatibilities. The process of building understanding and cooperation among the island's diverse communities took far longer than any of Maui's previous interventions and required sustained effort over many months. Unlike the dramatic solutions that characterized his earlier adventures, this challenge required patience, persistence, and a willingness to work through setbacks and temporary failures. However, the gradual development of trust and collaboration between the groups ultimately proved to be more satisfying and meaningful than even his most spectacular supernatural accomplishments. The success of this social intervention had ripple effects throughout the chain of islands that Maui had raised from the ocean depths. Other communities facing similar challenges of diversity and resource allocation sent delegations to learn about the methods that had been developed for building cooperation and resolving conflicts peacefully. Maui found himself serving as a different kind of teacher than he had ever been before, sharing not magical techniques or divine knowledge, but practical wisdom about human nature and social organization. This new role as a facilitator of human cooperation and social development proved to be deeply fulfilling for Maui in ways that his earlier adventures had not been. While raising islands from the ocean and snaring the sun had demonstrated his supernatural powers, helping diverse communities learn to live together harmoniously engaged aspects of his personality and wisdom that connected more directly to his mortal heritage and his understanding of human needs and motivations. The experience also deepened Maui's appreciation for the complexity and resilience of human nature. He came to understand that while people were capable of remarkable selfishness, pettiness, and destructiveness, they were equally capable of extraordinary generosity, wisdom, and creativity when given proper encouragement and support. The same communities that had been on the verge of warfare over resource disputes proved capable of developing innovative solutions that benefited everyone when they were guided toward cooperation rather than competition. As word of Maui's social interventions spread throughout the Pacific, he began to receive requests for assistance from established communities that were not facing immediate crises but wanted to improve their systems of governance, resource management, or conflict resolution. These requests represented a new understanding of Maui's role in Pacific society, not just as a provider of miraculous solutions to desperate problems, but as a source of ongoing wisdom and guidance for communities seeking to fulfill their highest potential. The development of this consultative role also created new opportunities for Maui to share the insights he had gained from his unique position between divine and mortal realms. He began to teach others about the principles of balance, cooperation, and mutual respect that governed relationships in the celestial sphere, showing how these same principles could be applied to create more harmonious human communities. This teaching work also allowed Maui to address some of the unintended consequences of his earlier interventions. While the availability of eternal fire, longer daylight hours, and new islands had generally improved life throughout the Pacific, these changes had also created new challenges and temptations that required ongoing attention and guidance. Maui worked with community leaders to develop systems that would preserve the benefits of his gifts while preventing them from being misused or taken for granted. Part 12: The Final Transformation. In the later years of Maui's active involvement with Pacific Island communities, as his reputation as both miracle worker and wise counselor had spread across thousands of miles of ocean, the demigod began to perceive that his greatest challenge still lay ahead. Through his divine sight and his deep connection to the cosmic forces that governed the universe, he became aware that the ultimate limitation on human potential was not external circumstances like inadequate fire, short days, or insufficient land, but rather the fundamental constraint of mortality itself. Death, Maui observed, was the great equalizer that rendered all other achievements temporary and all human aspirations ultimately futile. No matter how much he improved the conditions of life for Pacific Islanders, no matter how abundant their resources or how harmonious their communities, every individual would eventually succumb to age, disease, or accident, taking their accumulated wisdom and experience into the grave. This cycle of death and renewal, while natural and perhaps necessary, seemed to Maui to represent a tragic waste of human potential. The communities that Maui had helped to flourish were filled with remarkable individuals, skilled craftspeople who had spent decades perfecting their techniques, wise elders who had accumulated vast knowledge about weather patterns and seasonal cycles, gifted storytellers whose narratives preserved the cultural heritage of their people. Yet all this expertise and wisdom would eventually be lost when its possessors died, forcing each new generation to begin again from a position of relative ignorance and inexperience. Maui's divine heritage allowed him to perceive death not as an absolute ending, but as a transition between different states of existence. However, this transition was controlled by Hainu-Itiipa, the goddess of death and the underworld, whose domain was separate from and in many ways opposed to the realm of the living. For mortals to overcome the limitation of death would require somehow convincing this powerful deity to change the fundamental rules that governed the boundary between life and death. The contemplation of this ultimate challenge occupied Maui's thoughts for many months as he continued his work with island communities throughout the Pacific. He observed the grief of families who lost loved ones, the frustration of young people who were just beginning to understand their potential when their elders died, and the waste of knowledge and skills that occurred with each passing. He also began to notice that his own mixed divine heritage, while granting him extended life and supernatural abilities, did not make him truly immortal in the way that purely divine beings were. The decision to attempt the conquest of death was not made lightly, for Maui understood that this intervention would have consequences far beyond any of his previous adventures. Death was not simply another obstacle to human flourishing that could be overcome through clever problem-solving and divine power, but rather a fundamental aspect of the cosmic order that had existed since the beginning of creation. To change the nature of death would necessarily alter the entire relationship between divine and mortal realms. Moreover, Maui realized that his previous successes had been achieved through cooperation and negotiation with divine beings who could be convinced that changes would serve their own interests as well as those of humanity. Hainu-Itiipa, however, was unlikely to be amenable to arguments that would essentially eliminate her primary function and authority. This intervention would necessarily involve a degree of conflict and risk that exceeded anything Maui had previously undertaken. The preparation for this ultimate adventure required Maui to draw upon every aspect of his education and experience, both divine and mortal. From his celestial foster parents, he sought knowledge about the deepest mysteries of existence and death, learning about the spiritual mechanics that governed the transition between life and whatever lay beyond. From the wisest elders in the human communities he served, he gathered stories and traditions about heroes who had ventured into the realm of the dead and the lessons that could be learned from their successes and failures. The approach that Maui ultimately decided upon was characteristically audacious and unconventional. Rather than attempting to confront Hainu-Itiipa directly through force or negotiation, he would attempt to reverse the process of death by entering her body and emerging through her mouth while she slept, symbolically traveling backwards through the birth canal of death to achieve a form of rebirth that would grant immortality to all humanity. This plan required Maui to employ his shape-shifting abilities in ways that pushed them to their absolute limits, transforming himself into a form small enough to enter the goddess's body without waking her, while maintaining enough of his essential nature to survive the journey and accomplish his purpose. The transformation also had to be precise enough to allow him to navigate the interior spiritual landscape of the death goddess, where the rules of ordinary reality did not apply. The journey to Hainu-Itiipa's domain in the underworld required Maui to travel through regions of existence that were fundamentally hostile to living beings. Unlike his previous venture into Mahuika's realm, which had been dangerous but not antithetical to life itself, the approach to the death goddess's stronghold led through territories where the very concept of vitality was gradually drained away. Maui had to constantly reinforce his own life force to prevent it from being absorbed by the death-oriented energies that permeated these regions. When he finally reached the place where Hainu-Itiipa lay sleeping, Maui was struck by the terrible beauty and majesty of the goddess of death. She was simultaneously terrifying and magnificent, her form incorporating both the decay that marked the end of life and the peaceful rest that death could bring to those who had suffered. Her breathing was so slow and deep that each exhalation seemed to carry with it the final sighs of countless deceased mortals, while each inhalation drew in the life force of those who were approaching their end. The actual attempt to enter the goddess's body and reverse the process of death proved to be far more dangerous and complex than even Maui had anticipated. As he transformed himself into the tiny form necessary for his plan and began to enter Hainu-Itiipa's body, the goddess's spiritual defenses responded to the presence of an invader. Though she remained physically asleep, her unconscious mind recognized the threat to her authority and began to mobilize forces to repel the intruder. The interior of the death goddess's body was a landscape unlike anything that existed in the physical world, where spiritual forces took on quasi-physical forms and where the journey from entrance to exit required navigation through symbolic representations of the entire process of dying. Maui found himself traveling through regions that represented the gradual separation of consciousness from physical form, the review of life experiences that many reported during near-death experiences, and the final acceptance of mortality that allowed souls to transition peacefully into whatever lay beyond. As Maui progressed through this strange journey, he began to understand aspects of death and mortality that had never occurred to him before. He perceived that death was not simply an ending, but also a form of transformation that allowed consciousness to evolve beyond the limitations of physical existence. The fear and grief that mortals experienced in relation to death were based largely on ignorance about the true nature of this transformation, rather than on any inherent tragedy in the process itself. This revelation forced Maui to reconsider the entire premise of his mission. Perhaps the problem was not that humans died, but that they did not understand what death meant or how to approach it with wisdom and acceptance rather than fear. Perhaps the conquest of death would actually deprive humanity of an essential experience that was necessary for their spiritual development and ultimate fulfillment. However, even as these doubts arose, Maui continued his journey through the goddess's body, driven by his commitment to the mission and his desire to give humanity the choice of whether to accept mortality or transcend it. The final stage of his journey brought him to the point where he would need to emerge through Hainui-Tiipa's mouth, completing the symbolic reversal of birth that would theoretically grant immortality to all living beings. It was at this critical moment that the goddess's defenses finally succeeded in detecting and responding to Maui's presence. As he approached the threshold between life and death, Hainui-Tiipa's mouth suddenly closed, trapping the demigod between her powerful jaws. The goddess awakened fully, immediately understanding what had been attempted and recognizing the magnitude of the threat to the cosmic order that such an intervention would represent. In the final moments of his life, as Hainui-Tiipa's jaws closed upon him with the inevitability of death itself, Maui experienced a profound understanding of his place in the cosmic order and the true meaning of his various adventures and interventions. He realized that his greatest achievements had not been the spectacular displays of supernatural power that had made him famous throughout the Pacific, but rather the moments when he had helped human communities learn to cooperate, understand each other, and find meaning in their shared existence. The death of Maui sent ripples of change throughout both divine and mortal realms, for the loss of such a powerful and benevolent being could not occur without consequences. However, rather than representing a simple defeat or failure, Maui's sacrifice in the attempt to conquer death became a powerful symbol that inspired humans throughout the Pacific to approach their own mortality with greater courage and wisdom. The communities that Maui had served preserved his memory through stories, rituals, and cultural traditions that emphasized not his supernatural powers, but his dedication to serving others and his willingness to take extraordinary risks for the benefit of all humanity. These traditions helped people understand that while individual death was inevitable, the contributions that individuals made to their communities and the wisdom they shared with others could achieve a form of immortality that transcended physical existence. The islands that Maui had raised from the ocean depths continued to flourish, supporting thriving communities that preserved and developed the innovations he had introduced. The eternal fire continued to burn in temples and homes throughout the Pacific, providing not only practical benefits but also serving as a reminder of the divine spark that existed within all living beings. The longer days that resulted from his negotiation with the sun god continued to provide opportunities for human creativity and productivity that enriched countless lives. Closing meditation. As our journey through the legendary exploits of Maui draws to its close, let yourself rest in the warm glow of the eternal fire he brought to humanity, feeling the gentle heat that has warmed countless generations of Pacific Islanders through the long nights of their existence. The demigod who began as an abandoned infant cast into the stormy sea became a bridge between worlds, a translator of divine will into human understanding, and ultimately a symbol of the extraordinary potential that exists within the marriage of wisdom and courage. Feel the rhythm of your breathing slow and deepen, matching the eternal tide that laps against the shores of the islands Maui raised from the ocean depths. In your mind's eye, you can see these magnificent landmasses rising from the blue waters, bringing with them new possibilities for life, community, and the fulfillment of human dreams. The longer days he negotiated still bless us with time for reflection, creativity, and the simple joy of existing under the warm sun that learned to move with greater patience across the sky. Though Maui's physical journey ended in the realm of Hainui-Tiipa, his true immortality lies in the lasting changes he brought to the world and in the inspiration his story continues to provide to those who hear it. His legacy reminds us that the greatest heroism often lies not in spectacular displays of power, but in the patient work of building understanding between different peoples, solving practical problems that affect entire communities, and approaching even the greatest challenges with wisdom, humor, and an unshakable commitment to serving the common good. As you prepare to return from this mythical realm to your own time and place, carry with you the lessons of the great demigod, that seemingly impossible challenges can be overcome through the proper combination of courage and wisdom, that the most lasting solutions address root causes rather than mere symptoms, and that true power is best measured not by what one can accomplish for oneself, but by what one can achieve for others. Let the gentle sound of ocean waves carry you now toward peaceful sleep, knowing that the islands of dream await your arrival. If you're still awake, just breathe slowly and let the ancient stories drift with you. Subscribe to Mythology for sleep for a new legend every week. Sweet dreams.